toll, dass du das bemerkst. Aber es ist ganz
Zu spät, okay.
Hello everyone. Hi. I'm very glad to see so many people here at this panel. We're here today to discuss how big tech is redefining journalism. I'm really excited about this panel. So just to introduce myself and my co-panelists, I'm Alexandra Fanta. I'm a journalist with Netzpolitik.org, a German news website that covers digital issues, digital rights issues. To my left, there's Ingo Dachwitz, who's my colleague at Netzpolitik, Adrienne Fichter, who writes for Republik in Switzerland. We did a several months long investigation into the Google News Initiative, and we would like to present some of the findings and discuss it with the people on our right, which is Adam Thomas, director at the European Journalism Center, and Alexandra Borchardt, who is the director of the leadership program of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism in Oxford. So what are we debating here? We all know that companies like Google, Facebook, Apple have come to have a defining influence on journalism, on the way we find news, on the way we distribute news, on the way we monetize news. And increasingly, they have become patrons of the news industry, which is evident for everyone having a badge from this festival, because it is sponsored by Google, it is sponsored by Facebook, and I think Amazon pulled out of sponsoring it. So why are they actually sponsoring all that stuff? Just to explain my personal journey and how this topic came along for me, 2 years ago I had the opportunity to spend half a wonderful year in Oxford at the Reuters Institute as a journalist fellow, sponsored by Google. And after that, I had the opportunity to be in Switzerland for a couple of months with NZZ, working on automation in the newsroom, sponsored by Google. And after a year of being funded by Google, I was thinking, why are they doing all this? What is this about? I hatched a plan to nefariously investigate the very people who had been funding me. And I got some collaborators on board. So for a couple of months, we looked into 450 or so projects that the Digital News Initiative, now rebranded Google News Initiative of Google, had been funding. We tried to find out who got the money, what were they doing with it, and what type of organizations are getting the money. And here you see the self-description of the Google News Initiative. They're just trying to help the news industry thrive. But of course, they're not entirely disinterested in the news industry, and this is something I think we should discuss more. So briefly again, for those who are not kind of following the innovation funding circuit that closely, the News Initiative was founded in 2015. It was, in a way, kind of a reaction to... Okay. So the News Initiative was funded as a reaction to various European countries discussing Google taxes, taxes on digital advertising, snippet taxes, and so forth. So Google came out in 2015 and said, we pledge 150 million euros for European journalism. They have so far distributed most of the money, have only expanded, and Google's model worked as a template. So now you have Facebook also pledging 300 million euros for journalism, and you have other large tech corporations moving ever more closely. I mean, recent days, Apple News Plus launched, which is set to probably become a major distributor of news. So what are all these tech companies, what is their interest? So I think it's now time to hand over to Ingo, who will give you a bit of a rundown of what we looked at and what our findings were last year.
Yeah. Thank you, Alex. Let's have a look at... our research or our investigation. So let me start with a short description of our method researching the Digital News Initiative and its Innovation Fund. Core of our reporting was a data analysis we conducted in 2018. Unfortunately, Google doesn't publish too many details about the projects, and not in a machine-readable format. So what we did is that we scraped all project descriptions from the 447 DNI sub-websites and compiled them in our own database. And then we combined this data with additional information we collected manually. This includes information on the founding year of the beneficiary and the country it operates in. Also, we added some typologies, type of beneficiary organization, for example, or the type of innovation the project is dealing with. And last but not least, we added information on the concrete funding amounts, or at least we tried to do that, because Google doesn't publish concrete numbers, but only funding categories. So the so-called prototype projects would receive up to 50,000 euro, medium projects between 50,000 and 300,000 euro, and large projects between 300,000 and 1 million euro. This was a bit tricky because many beneficiaries decided not to publish the concrete funding numbers themselves proactively and even declined to talk about it after we asked them. So although we reached out to almost every single one of the 447 projects of the first 4 rounds, in the end we only got concrete numbers for about half of them. To make this transparent, this is an obvious limitation to our research or to our investigation, because for some of our analysis, we had to work with estimations of numbers because we didn't have the concrete numbers. And also, we only looked at the first 4 rounds out of 6. So from the 150 million euros Google would give to media companies in Europe until 2019, we analyzed 94 million euros that were distributed until June 2018. Naturally, our reporting also included interviews with beneficiaries, around about 30 beneficiaries we talked to, and Google representatives, as well as interviews with academics. We published our findings and the whole data set in September 2018, so if you're interested to work with the data set, you're invited to do that. You can find it on our website. Okay, so what did we find in the data? I want to shed light on 3 biases we found in the data before Adrienne will have a look at the bigger picture of the relationship between Google and media. The first bias our data shows is concerning the question of what sort of innovation Google is fostering with the Digital News Initiative. And here we found a heavy bias towards projects dealing with automation. According to our analysis, in the first 4 rounds, about 40 million euros, or 41% of the whole payout, went into projects that were working on some type of data-driven automation. Only half of this sum, 20 million euros, went into projects that try to create new formats, for example, virtual reality journalism. Projects dealing with monetization, other than advertising, received 13% of the share. Community projects got 12%, and fact-checking and advertising projects received 6% of the share each. We found this to be a noteworthy bias, not because we think that funding automation in journalism is in general a bad thing, or that Google should have put more money in projects dealing with fact-checking, but this data illuminates that when you let a tech company fund innovation in journalism, it shapes kind of the way we think about innovation and the way we think about the future of journalism. Naturally, a fund like DNI doesn't fund or focus on questions of organization or structures or culture, but focuses on automating stuff. A second bias we found was one towards companies in Western Europe. Media organizations in Western Europe benefit a lot more from the DNI than those in Eastern European countries when we speak of total numbers. With a total amount of 3.9 million euros, Poland was the only Eastern European country that made it to the list of the top 10 receiving countries, with Germany being on top with approximately 15 million euros, followed by the UK and France, Spain, Italy, and Portugal. In total, we found that in the first 4 rounds, 88% of the 94 million euros went to beneficiaries in Western Europe, so Eastern European countries received a share of 11.7 million euros. And Third bias that we found is one towards commercial and established media. According to our data, 65 million euros went to the organization type that we called commercial media, so classic content producing companies. This is 70% of the whole budget. The second biggest group was that of companies that don't create content their own but develop services for media. They received around about 16%, 15 million euros. Not-for-profit media and public service media only received about 5 million euros each. Universities received 2%, and individuals in total made it to 1%. Interesting to note here is that more than half of the beneficiary organizations was older than 20 years. So when you think about D&I as a tool of innovation or funding innovation, bear in mind that funding focuses on innovation inside existing structures mostly here. In fact, many of the bigger news organizations applied for funding with several projects in different funding rounds. So single companies in total received more than 1 million euros from Google D&I. In Germany, this was, for example, Spiegel Online, Handelsblatt and FAZ, Le Monde in France, and NZZ in Switzerland, just to name a few. Yeah, don't get us wrong, it's not that the Innovation Fund did not give money to startups. In fact, though it would be over the top to speak of like a new funding or startup culture, inspired by D&I, many of the younger companies we talked to made it very clear that kickoff has been way harder. It would have been way harder for them if it wasn't for the D&I funding. But nevertheless, to summarize the results of our data analysis, we can say that the typical beneficiary of the News Innovation Fund is a well-established Western European newspaper enterprise. And with that, I hand over to Adrienne to take a look at the bigger picture.
Let me just interject. So I think I didn't say that before. We shared kind of the data among us. So we also, Adrienne from Republik also did stories based on the same data, and Fanta in Austria.
Thank you, Ingo and Alexandra. So I will draw a broader picture about the Google media ecosystem. As you see, Google is offering various tools, projects, software, formats for the media ecosystem. I just want to pick a few of them listed here. Digital News Initiative, we know now what it is. There is also tracking, analytics tools, advertisement. You might know the Google DoubleClick AdSense program. Online publishers are using this program, DoubleClick, to display adverts on their website. It is the leading provider for ads intermediation, and it just got recently also an antitrust fine from the European Commission. You might have heard about that. Then let me just pick the accelerated mobile pages. You might have heard also about that. It's a publishing technology developed by Google for traffic increase on mobile, for mobile, especially, and also for providing a better user experiences because of the improved loading time for users. It's introduced several years ago. A lot of publishers are working with it, but there's no clear evidence how useful AMP, the accelerated mobile pages, are. There's no clear evidence about that, if it's really boosting traffic or not. Some publishers have said that they have limited access to reader data, or they cannot display other advertising formats. So we still, it's one of the most used formats from Google for the publishers, but we still don't know how useful it is at the end. And then Alexandra has already mentioned it, festivals like this one here is funded by Google. So there, I was counting there also 4 or 5 sessions about the Google News initiative here at the Borchardt Festival, International Journalism Festival. And so nowadays it's almost impossible to attend a news conference or hear about experimentation in newsrooms without seeing Google's name on the funding credits. Next one. So let me talk about the publisher's perspective, the lessons we made after talking to publishers and also to journalists. So here are some of the learnings. First of all, why do publishers involve? Why do they want funding from the Google News Initiative? They framed it to us as a way of having a strategic advantage to have a dialogue with Google after years of being powerless, to have now at least some conversation with Google going on. And they also framed it as a way of giving something back. So big tech companies are giving something back now to the publishers after years of loss of advertising revenues, and also after years of search algorithm, which is kind of also undermining the business model of some publishers, especially in terms of the paywall. So it's a dialogue. Then second, there is a cleavage between the publishers and journalists. There is nearly no conversation about this topic, Google News Initiative, between publishers and journalists. So the journalists I was talking to, the media and technology reporter, are really worried about what is the impact on the reader's trust, how this might affect readers' trust in journalism in general. And there's no dialogue, conversation going on. They told me also everyone knows, or someone who is creating a news online product knows that technical architecture, software, and tools are also shaping shaping aspects of the editorial content in the end. And they also say, so we need to hold big tech accountable and don't mix that with the business models and infrastructures of the publishers. From the publisher's perspective, on the other hand, there is little awareness about these concerns. They told me Google is not influencing the editorial content at the end. So there's no conversation going on, as I said. And also Ingo has already mentioned it, there's little transparency about the exact numbers funding. Also, this was very, bit of work, forensic work, to find out the numbers, the specific numbers. Then third, the project manager from the several publishers told me it's very easy to get money from Google. So if there is just little bureaucracy, if you compare that to the application process of an independent, of a foundation, it's just, you don't have to do a lot of quality monitoring. Well, it was what the project manager told me. I cannot evaluate this, but after the project was launched, after you get the funding, they barely control. That's why several publishers, especially legacy media in Switzerland, were applying for several rounds at Google News Initiative and also get the money at the end. And in some cases, we asked, but this question needs further investigation and research, if there is a change in media coverage between 2015 and 2018 about Google News Initiative. I can only say about one case in Switzerland. I was monitoring, I made a request on the Swiss media database about a specific publisher who, in 2015, when Google announced we will roll out the Google News Initiative also for Europe, a columnist was commenting that with sharp words, saying Google's commitment to journalism is kind of like a snake, a python, which is hugging its jungle comrades, and at the end everyone dies. But then the columnist later was not commenting about it anymore. I don't know if there is a correlation or not, but I think it's a question we really need to do independent research on.
Well, thanks a lot, Ingo and Adrienne. So I would really like to hand this over.
Let's just sum up quickly our conclusion, just to sum it up, just to wrap it up before we give the floor to our respondents. Okay, the first takeaway is kind of obvious. The whole initiative, and especially the Innovation Fund, is characterized by some sort of opaque transparency. It's not that there is no information. Nothing happens in the dark here. In fact, Google itself, it released 2 so-called reports about the initiative with great stories, shiny pictures, and also some numbers in it. But I would say for public scrutiny to happen, for journalists or academia to get an actual picture of what is going on in the initiative and in the fund. This is not enough. For our research, again, we had to scrape 450 websites and build our own database, not to speak of how frustrating it was trying to research every single funding amount. So I'd say for any media or university, this should not be tolerable. At least they should do, the least they should do to avoid the impression that this is the greatest bribe campaign in the history of journalism, is to publish the exact funding amounts or push Google to do it proactively.
Yeah, so I think it's really important to talk about the strategic goals that the tech companies have. I think, you know, we have the deep suspicion that they're out to dominate the world of online advertising, and that has profound impacts for the news ecosystem. Yeah, so they are transforming media companies from, in some ways, from adversaries to partners.
And yeah, just to end the conclusion, so further integration into the Google ecosystem means that publishers ask themselves more and more, what would Google want? So we need to bear in mind also that all big tech companies like Google, Facebook, and Amazon have the strategy also how to manage the press. We need to be aware of that. And also, yeah, there is these tools, there is this project funded by Google, but we only have very little data about what's happening on the platforms and what the effect of it is. So we think it's crucial to have independent tech reporting as a vital form of accountability.
Yeah, so we conclude there is a funding gap, and we need answers that don't involve the, you know, in some ways, interesting largesse of private companies. But that said, now that we have heaped scorn and criticism on the funding of Google, I would like to also kind of talk with people who I think have a different opinion on this. Adam, you wrote you do a project at the European Journalism Center with Google, and you wrote a blog post why we work with Google and Facebook. So I was hoping to get a different perspective from you on this.
Yeah, sure, thanks. So yeah, just for background, the European Journalism Center is a Dutch non-profit. We've been around for almost 27 years at this point, and our goal is to build resilience into European journalism. Google News Initiative is one of our funders. I think tech funding accounts for about 33% this year of what I would call our gross margin, which is when you take away the project costs, what the center receives. So about 30% of it comes from tech, around 50% comes from philanthropy, and then the rest comes from governments, either national governments or from the EU in some form or another. And we do grants, we do training, we do events, and we do media development. And Google actually, this year, full transparency, will probably receive about 1 million euros gross revenue from Google for 5 different programs. And none of them are part of the Digital News Initiative, by the way. And actually, I think that's a whole area that will be really interesting for your research. I think there's a couple of really big areas you've missed in terms of their influence that I think will be interesting for your next project to map. So the 5 programs that we have are News Impact Summits, which are events of 300, 400 people. We have News Impact Academies, which is a leadership program and is around culture and change in newsrooms and furthering that. We have a fellowship program which puts students into newsrooms to try and bring diversity into newsrooms and help students also get more work experience. So we have, I guess, a range of programs that definitely fit more in the training and leadership side of things than the straight-up innovation. And our work has mostly been with what was called the Google News Lab, which you didn't mention, but that's actually what became the GNI, and then I believe DNI got rolled into that. It's a little confusing, but the way I understand Google's ecosystem from our perspective is they have the product side of things, which includes AdSense, includes AMP, but also includes things like Trends and Google Maps, which they're very keen on getting journalists to use, and journalists are keen on using them, in my experience. They then have the funding pot, which is DNI, and then they have the type of money that we take, which is more about training. So I think that distinction is important, and I'm really pleased that you've done the research on DNI we've been pushing for more transparency in this space, and I think it's been really, really valuable. And I think we should look at seeing how we can open that transparency up to the training initiatives as well.
Yeah, so I'd like to hand over to Alexandra, who has, I think, a very kind of mixed perspective on this, which I'm very excited to hear about.
Yeah, thank you so much. First of all, when you just brought to our attention that Google News Initiative was just founded in 2015, I was really amazed because it's only been 4 years, and every time I turn around the corner, it seems there's something Google or stamped on it, like every conference you go to. Yeah, and also some disclosure here. I used to be managing editor for Süddeutsche Zeitung in Germany, biggest German quality newspaper that explicitly says that we don't take money from Google, so we didn't engage in any projects or cooperation because we wanted to keep our independence. Now that I'm a director of leadership programs at the Reuters Institute in Oxford, University of Oxford, actually we have a fairly large Google grant to help us operating, and also we have journalist fellows sponsored by Google quite a bit. Even though our leadership programs, the part I run, is not sponsored by Google, and that actually sometimes makes it hard when I listen to what you can offer, and you get all the funding. We make our clients, our customers pay, so that's actually very unusual in the news industry these days, that people really actually have to pay for their leadership courses. Yes, but there's another way I'm engaged with Google-funded projects. I'm a media columnist at News Mavens. That's Europe's first and only all-female newsroom, and that is also sponsored by Google News Initiative, so there's quite some entanglement. First thing I want to say is actually the media industry, as you all know, is in no situation to reject funding by anybody. So major thing I would say is support is better than no support, because journalism needs all the help it can get. Even though, obviously, it's really tough if there's a structural dependence, and we learned about that, and I found this research fascinating, that, the more and more tech companies, not only Google, but also Facebook, Apple, get involved, the more and more dependence is there, that the newsrooms, even if they decline to take money, they're really depending on the platforms. Yes, I still think it's a good thing there is this money, that there are these funds, because it enables experiments, and it helps newsrooms to experiment with stuff. So as long as there's no dependence on projects, I would always encourage this. And obviously, it's a way of giving back, even though I don't particularly like the term giving back, because actually the platforms, first of all, they took quite a bit, or they've been taking quite a bit, and I mean, every one of you is aware of the huge chunk of advertising, digital advertising money that goes to these platforms, that captures the major share of advertising money. So giving back is kind of this, we give you something back. So we should see it more, and I think it's important to come to see it more as a partnership and as something where, actually the news industry deserves something, and it's not like some sort of mercy kind of thing, giving back something. I would like to make this a little bit more practical, because there are many of you here in this room who actually might need some guidance or some ideas how to deal with this funding. So first of all, looking at the recipients of this funding. And the first and most crucial thing is, I think, is that you have a diversity of funding. I mean, that used to be the business model in media all the time, having a diversity of funding. I mean, the major advertising model was based on a diversity of funding. You had big clients, but if someone pulled out, well, you can always rely on other advertisers to replace it. So just look at your portfolio and see if there is enough diversity in the funding. For example, at the Reuters Institute, we have a Google grant, but we also are supported by Facebook, and we are supported by our by other funders. And this is our constant struggle to engage more funders, to have a diversity of funding. So yes, and the second thing is, don't let your complete business depend on these platform companies. I mean, you can engage with stuff, but you should still know what you're doing and that you can run and operate a business, even if they just just pull out their support. So there's a constant thinking also at our organization. What if Google withdrew the money? Could we still operate? Would we still be alive? Could we still fulfill our mission? And actually, yes, we can. You should really think about that. Third thing is just take whatever makes sense for your business. Think about your mission, your business, and whatever you want to achieve, and just take support for that, and don't engage in any shiny things, like just something that looks like fun and it's interesting. Because the danger is, if you build up structures, then you have you hire all these people, and then suddenly funding is gone, and you have to lay off people again, or you just have to sort of push your team around from one project to the next. You shouldn't do that. Predictability and stability is really important when you're running a business. Also, think about what you use the money for. For example, we would never, as an institute, do research on the power of platforms financed by Google or Facebook. That's just really important. So separate whatever you use the money for when it's directly linked to something that has something to do with the platforms. And then with research, make sure that the donors don't interfere what the research is. You need independent bodies to really make sure that the quality of your findings are impartial, and that you have the right methods, whatever. Don't let your donors interfere with whatever you do and how you conduct your research. Next thing is, think about your reputation. There was this huge, actually I'm also based in Munich, and I teach at TU Munich, and TU Munich recently accepted a huge Facebook grant studying AI and the ethics of AI, and there was a huge debate about that in the media. So before you accept money, think about how your reputation could suffer. That doesn't mean that you can't take the money, but just think about what could happen, and don't be surprised if there are discussions about this. And lastly, for the recipients, well, if you can, then don't take the money. That doesn't mean that you can't take it, but if you can afford it, don't take it, because actually independence is fantastic and others might need it more. Then there's the second block is the guidance for the donors, the ones who give the money. Ideally separate funding from any kinds of requirements. You just from any kinds of demands that you have on the recipients. Listen to the recipients. Really look at the whole industry. Look what they really need and what's important, and don't create dependencies that the businesses can't get rid of in case of doubt. And really important, don't make funding contingent on political goals. Or if you do, please be open about it. If you want to engage in some kind of lobbying and then you give some money to it, just be completely transparent, because I think transparency and predictability are the two basic things that really make this work. Don't ever threaten, if you don't do this, if you do that, I'll withdraw funding. That's just something that shouldn't happen under any circumstances. And, well, if you want to be taken seriously, don't let the funding look like peanuts. Oh, this is just, we can give them some pocket money on the side, and then, on the other hand, we run our big business. So really engage if you want to engage. And last but not least, and the most important thing for all these big companies is, please pay taxes, because this is the way in democratic society we want to redistribute. Redistribute resources, and then we want to just make our own democratic decisions about how and who we want to support. So paying taxes is at the core of it. Otherwise, it's really hard to be taken seriously as a good citizen if you want to create that image. Thank you.
Wow. Well, thanks, Alexandra, for this very strong contribution. Thank you, Adam. I think you really kind of highlighted how we, I think, take maybe a different perspective on this, but we have some fundamental agreements. It's unfortunately, nobody from Google directly wanted to participate in this panel. You will find that they are, to some extent, they're not really keen on engaging with these kind of arguments. So let me get a quick response from the other side of the panel and then hand it over to the audience, because I know that there's a couple of people who really could have an interesting contribution from the audience.
Okay, I start. Thank you very much. What you said, I strongly agree, how to deal with this funding. So what we found out, or what I found out, especially among the publishers in Switzerland, there's no real policy about how to communicate the funding of the Google News Initiative. And also, yeah, there's no communication policy at all. So if there is more transparency and more predictability, I would support that. Yes, if you can, don't take the money. I think this is this is the main problem right now. The publishers I was talking to, they say if there was not this Google News Initiative, we would not build this this tool which is sorting out all troll comments. We would not do that. Although they maybe got, I don't know, 500,000 Swiss francs, which is, yeah, 500,000 euros. So it's just actually peanuts if you compare, but they told me they would not take the money. So this is also, I think, one of the crucial problems. And what you also said, the reputation. I think this is the most important topic. It doesn't matter why publishers take money from Google or why Google is offering that. At the end, I think the reader's perspective is very crucial, the reader's trust in publishers, and I think we also need some studies about that, how this affects, how readers perceive that if there is such a big dependence of the Google ecosystem and also about the Google News Initiative. So last week in the Columbia Journalism Review, there was an article with the sentence, which I strongly agree with, that, yeah, at the end, Google, Facebook, and Amazon do things we need to investigate and not profiting from it.
Very good. So I'm hoping to take 2-3 questions from the audience, and then maybe we can discuss it further in the panel. Is there any contributions? Is anyone taking money from Google and wants to talk about it, or doesn't take money from Google, wants to talk about it? Okay.
Thank you. Very interesting discussion. My name is Miles Smith. I'm from a media development organization called Intranews. We take a small, tiny amount of money from GNI for fact-checking programs in India, Indonesia. One thing that we found that was troubling was they always wanted to push for more and more participants, for fewer and fewer training days, and we were always concerned that they were pushing us to compromise the quality of the product to get the numbers up. And when they're not being that transparent about what they're doing, it didn't really seem like that should matter to them, but it was hard to push back on them. And I'm curious also if you have any experience with Facebook in this same line of work, could comment on the comparison between GNI and Facebook. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Is there another reaction direct from the audience now? Okay, then maybe I can hand it over to the panel. Could I get one of you then? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, on the first point, it's not something I think that we've experienced in terms of compared to other donors, for instance. So I'd be interested in hearing from you, Miles, whether you think, let's say, NED or the US State Department or any of those other governmental funders, let's say, are tougher in terms of the kind of the pushback you get. That's definitely my experience, is that governmental funders are definitely tougher on the kind of metrics that they set. And for me and for the European Journalism Centre, I think that's one of the key questions that we ask ourselves when it comes to whether we're going to take money from this particular organisation or not. I think you really have to think about the key structures of the arrangement there, and the metrics for success are one of the key ones, because that's really what you're going to come down to at the end of the 1-year period or the 3-year period. And those are the things that are most conducive to an open funding relationship where you can really get stuff done, which is why we do it. But there can also be the things that really limit you. If you have one set of metrics that are under the table and you have an agreement with the publishers, with the funders, and then kind of over the top of the table you have a different PR strategy around what this money is for, that's where it's challenging. But it's not something I've experienced with Google. With Facebook, we have one very small grant from them where we produce some training videos around journalism safety, so it's definitely not at the minute in the same ballpark. But I think my general comment there on big tech is, or any funder in fact, is are they going to be a good ally for the industry and for your organization? So I definitely echo a lot of Alexandra's comments around the practicalities of this. And I think to really understand that, you need to think about what's the motivation of the organization. In some instances, it's going to be around PR, just plain and simple, and some of that with a regulation aspect to it. That's obviously potentially very, very dangerous. And I think especially with Google sending an email to D&I recipients, asking them to vote a particular way or to lobby a particular way for Article 13, that's really, really problematic, and I think was a huge strategic mistake in that regard. So I think that's something important. I think you need to think about the business goals of the organization, and I think that's one thing we haven't really talked about here, is the difference between some of these organizations, Facebook, Google, etc., is how aligned are the business goals of that organization with the business goals of the publishers? Do Google need news organizations in order to survive? Do they need that ecosystem to make their products better? And then you ask the same of Facebook and Amazon and so on. So I think that's a key point.
Well, do they? What do you think?
I think Google do. I think the products are better because journalists are amazing organizers of information. They structure information. Google Search, for instance, needs those backlinks. It needs sites of authority. And I think, therefore, their products are much better because of news organizations, and I think that's one of the main motivators for their work in this area, definitely to a larger extent than, let's say, Amazon.
I think I might also add that news websites are a major way in which Google and Facebook track users, and they collect data even when you're not a Google or Facebook user. They collect data on you, and that will be used to track you across the internet and display targeted advertising to you. And in that sense, I think we did a kind of a survey of German-speaking news websites, and 4 out of 5 have some kind of Google tracking cookie embedded in their site, not to talk of any other tracking cookies. So I think we also have to think of the media industry to some extent as an unwitting accomplice to the massive data collection and to the business model of Google and Facebook.
Yeah.
Alexandra?
Yeah, to your question again, I can't tell you anything about the individual business relationship with the differences between Google, Facebook, whatever. But we did this study. We published this annual Trends and Predictions in Media, Journalism, and Technology in January, and that's a survey among media leaders. And we asked them, how important are different platforms for you? And I can't tell you from the top of my mind, but I just know, and you might want to look into the data, that Google was extremely much more important to publishers this year than, for example, Facebook. Facebook declined in importance. So maybe you could look into this data, and everybody knows that Apple's really a tough one helping the industry flourish, because that's much more about helping Apple flourish, and there's huge dependence also with the new idea about subscription models, and there's really not a great sense of benefit sharing in Apple leadership.
Yes.
Hi.
Hi. I was really interested in your comment, Alexandra, that the term giving back is problematic. And given how you described the structural relationship between Google and news organizations, I'm wondering if you have any recommendations for how journalists describe that relationship, the words that they use to cover it on a daily or weekly basis, because that language obviously has a tremendous role in influencing how the public sees that relationship, and frankly, I think how we understand, our own rapport. So I'd love to know, if, from your vantage point now, if you've seen ways that have been, words that have been used that you think are much more accurate, much more true to form and purpose.
Could you also introduce yourself briefly?
Sure. I'm Amanda Mickel, Global Contributions Director from The Guardian.
Okay. Well, thank you, Amanda. You're right. I mean, language is important, and we have to bear in mind that all these big, or most of these, basically these big tech platforms are American. So there's a cultural difference here, and in the States, in America, the term giving back is very pervasive in culture because they don't have the system that, you just pay. Well, Americans also pay taxes, but redistribution of income, wealth, whatever, is not such a big thing. It's more about voluntarily giving back. So this is very pervasive also in this model. And I really liked this research project. I think the headline was "The Patrons of the News Industry," something like that. And this is the publishers' patrons. And the patronage model is really that. What's all behind this? We Europeans think very differently about this. We think about it as shared responsibility if we want to make the news industry flourish. And if there's a concept of responsibility and shared responsibility, I'd like that so much more. But then it's not something of giving back, but it's much more of shared responsibility, and even, as I said before, something maybe deserving something.
I was signaled we're close to the end of this panel, so maybe I want to take one more question from the audience, from the gentleman over there, and then we can go to some final comments. Mm-hmm.
Yes, hello, I'm Mark Nelson. I'm from the Center for International Media Assistance in Washington. Thank you so much for this panel. I think it's been a really interesting conversation. The question that comes to my mind after listening to this, I think it's really important to understand these relationships between funders and the way that the news industry works. But one of the deeper questions that nobody seems to be able to answer, and I think what is an area of even deeper lack of transparency, is what is the value of news to these organizations, and how are they monetizing it themselves? Because, I think when you talk about shared responsibilities and all of this, sharing revenue in a normal way, in a way that recognizes the contributions of the news industry and journalists to these platforms would be a much bigger goal to try to reach than trying to get more money out of them in less captured ways. I mean, it would seem to me that the relationship we're looking for is one where news producers and journalists are recognized financially through their contributions, and that's monetized in a way that's transparent and open.
Thanks. So maybe Alexandra or Adam will...
Well,
yeah.
If you had someone from Facebook on this panel, they would tell you the exact share of, how much of our content is news and how much of it is the rest, and the rest would be, the absolute majority. So it's really, from a Facebook perspective, I mean, you could see how fast or how easy it is to tamper with this. They just have to change their algorithms, and then, the share of news in the feed just drops. They say, oh, it's actually dealing with news is too complicated, let's just drop it. So there's not that much responsibility there. I would love to be there, an insight into the importance of journalism and what it means for society, what it means for stability even. And I mean, you can see with all the discussions about hate speech and whatever, what happens if there's no responsibility? What happens if something happens, if there's all this insecurity about elections and campaigns, and are there influences, and no matter how big these influences really are. But yeah, these debates are important. So, if all this was important, then, news should play a role, but I can't necessarily see that it's of utmost importance to Mark Zuckerberg and the like.
Maybe if I can just add really quickly there, I think it's a great point, and I think it comes back to this giving back question. Is this CSR, is this philanthropy in some kind of way? Because if it is, philanthropists have a lot of regulation around how transparent they have to be, what they do with the money, etc. Or is it a symbiotic business relationship, in which case that we should talk about it in those terms? And I think one of the challenges at the minute is that we are somewhere mixed up between that, those two things, but then also this kind of PR positive image type of work. And I think the quicker that we can move to those distinctions, Mark, I think we get to a better place.
Great, great point.
Just wanted to add one point. Thank you very much for this question. I think especially for Facebook, So for Facebook perspective, it's a lot about time spent, maximizing this parameter. And so if news are useful for that, okay, so we're gonna honoring that through via newsfeed algorithm. So Mark Zuckerberg has announced in 2013, I want Facebook to be the personalized newspaper for everyone. And then I would say, I was working in this time for legacy media in Switzerland for the NZZ. I could see there was a huge traffic increase via social media, especially via Facebook from 2013 to 2017. Then the whole fake news debate has started. So Mark Zuckerberg has announced, okay, we will tweak the algorithm once more because the user feedback is we want to see more people's content, family content in the news feed. And so there was, as Alexandra already said, a huge drop in traffic. And now, I really ask myself this question, does Facebook really care about quality journalism? Because now they have this strategy of keeping news, don't prioritize it in the newsfeed algorithm. At the same time, they won't invest into local news and local journalism. So we will see how this is going to work.
Yes, I think that's an important point. So we've heard really about how important it is to distinguish the various relationships that the news media industry and the companies have. And I'd like to give the final word to Ingo, who I think wanted to...
Just to point to one last point, I think that, or the elephant in the room, I think it's very important that we talk about the relationship between big tech and journalism and media corporations. But I think the bigger issue is the question of why do we have to talk about the lack of funding for journalism. That is the issue at stake here. So I think it's very important that we kind of talk about the motivations, strategic goals, and also how to create a stable relationship between big tech and journalism organizations. But the bigger question at stake is how to fund journalism. And I mean, Alexandra, you said any support is better than no support. I mean, it's very true, but very telling for the situation we're in with journalism right now. So I guess we didn't have the time to grapple on those big questions here, but I think just want to point out that we...
Yeah, let's have another panel on that one.
Okay, so I really hope we can keep engaging on this throughout the festival. Let's talk about this some more off the record. Thank you all for showing up to this panel.